The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our third Thursday webinar. I'm Margot Hoffman with the Partnership for Excellence, and we welcome you to this webinar. The topic is Measure plus Analyze plus Learn equals Organizational Performance. And our presenters today are Denise and Jason from Memorial Hospital and Healthcare Center, a recent Baldrige recipient. If you look in your control panel, we do have a copy of the presentation in the handout box of the control panel. So if you are interested in downloading that so you have a copy of it, you can do it right from that box in the control panel. Today, I'm going to cover a few announcements, introduce our speakers, and then, of course, the main attraction is today's presentation, and then we'll have time at the end for any questions. We do have everyone muted because we have quite a few attendees today, which is fantastic. And so if you have any questions, you can type them in the question box, which is located in your control panel, and I will read those questions and share them with our presenters. You can also raise your hand and we can unmute your microphone. But with a lot of presenters, it's nice just to type them in the question box. I just want to share with you some upcoming events that our programs have. And I also want to share with you that we have another program that has joined us in hosting these webinars. Performance Excellence Northwest has joined us. So as you can see here, we have the links for the various programs where you can find their events. Two programs that currently have events scheduled right now is Performance Excellence Northwest has a learning symposium from September 14th through the 18th, which you can access information at their website here, shown here. And then TPE, the Partnership for Excellence, we have our annual Quest for Success conference, which we are doing virtually this year on September 14th and 15th. And you can find information about that and ways to register on our website. I would like to thank all of the organizational members from our 6 programs. We are 5013C organization, so we greatly appreciate the support of our organizational members who allow us to cultivate performance excellence in our state programs. Okay, I would now like to introduce our presenters. We have Jason Berry, who is the EPIC Cogito project manager. I'm sure I said that wrong, with Memorial Hospital and Healthcare Center. He was formerly their patient experience officer, and so he's heard it all, even feedback about toilet paper. So just one pair of ears listening to the voice of their customer and community. Jason brings a non-clinical perspective to the continuum of patient care. He believes the empathetic human element is the key to positive clinical and emotional experience for both caregiver and patient. Drawing from skills developed in sales, executive leadership, and a biology degree, Jason finds a balance between clinical and everyday language that bridges the gap in communication. Under his guidance, Jason uses the voice of the customer to be more proactive and education-driven. Denise Katzel is the Director of Organizational Excellence and Quality for Memorial Hospital and Healthcare Center. Leading with compassion and respect for all, Denise encourages and expects team members to commit to quality and excellence. She is passionate about personal and professional growth through continuous learning, excellent patient organizational outcomes, and performance improvement. Denise is committed to the mission, vision, and core values of Memorial Hospital. And I now will turn it over to Denise and Jason, who are going to also pull up their presentation as they get started.
All right, are you able to see the screen, Margot?
We sure can. You're all set.
All right, excellent. Well, welcome everyone to this third Thursday TPE webinar. And today we're going to be discussing with you ways that Memorial Hospital address category 4 of the Baldrige Excellence Framework. In addition to what we're going to share today, we also have a booklet that initially we prepared when we did our National Quest presentations at the conference in 2019, and the booklet was very well received. It actually has many of our processes, models, and information from our journey in it. So if you'd like a copy, if you can get your name and mailing address to Margot, we will get one out to you. We always start our presentations with our hospital mission statement. Christ's healing mission of compassion empowers us to be for others through quality and excellence, and really just to set the stage for who we are, as this certainly shapes our culture, our processes, and how we deliver care.
Good morning, everyone. When we first began our journey to excellence, we realized that we needed a definition of excellence, and we needed to know what excellence looked like at Memorial Hospital and Healthcare Center. As with all of the Baldrige framework, you can't prove it if you can't measure it, and you can't measure it if you can't define it. So we chose to define excellence within each of our 5 covenants. Most organizations have pillars. They may be pillars around people, growth, finances, etc. We chose to use covenants rather than pillars because we're a faith-based organization, and a covenant is a promise. Our covenants are caregiver engagement, quality and safety, innovation, community, and stewardship. We intentionally list caregiver engagement first and stewardship last. We use the covenants in how we organize our strategic plan, all of our SMART goals, our scorecards, rounding issues, etc. So it's important that each of these definitions of excellence are kept front of mind so they can be reviewed and revised as appropriate. Our senior leaders will review the definitions of excellence and revise them when necessary every quarter at the quarterly business review, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in a few minutes. However, it's important that more than just our senior leaders know the difference or know the definitions of excellence. We need to share them with our whole leadership team and our entire workforce. How can they be expected to work towards excellence unless they understand how it is defined? Definitions are included with our organizational scorecard each month and posted on our internal intranet for employees to see. As we define excellence, we set our goals for top decile performance, incremental improvement, and whenever possible, we compare ourselves against national benchmarks. When those aren't available or when we're already exceeding them, we set our own internal goals. So some of the metrics on our HARM scorecard, such as readmissions, are red and yet still exceed national benchmarks. So this is an instance where we set our own goals and targets above and beyond the national level benchmarks to continually drive improvement. This challenges all of our caregivers to never settle to lose sight of what is best for our patients. Up on the screen, this is an example of our manager scorecard, or example of a manager scorecard that might not necessarily be widely shared or included on some of the alignment boards, because the data here can be misinterpreted pretty easily, and really it's used to monitor trends rather than month-by-month tracking. That's not to say that we're not going to look at each of these months individually. As you can see, there were some outliers, particularly in January and May. Upon review, we were able to attribute those to kind of a reaction to low volumes. For instance, the January AMI readmission rate of 50% was the result of 1 readmission with only 2 patients. And I can imagine many of you have experienced some of the fluctuations in census like we did back in April and May. They help to contribute to some interesting anomalies as we look back at some of that data. Now you can see a few examples of one measure from each of our 5 covenants. As we created these, it was important that our senior leaders gathered input from the expertise within our organization. For example, under our covenant of quality and safety, we turned to Denise to help us to define some of these measures. And as you just saw, we tracked total harm on our harm across the board scorecard, and we use these definitions to push us to excellence and never settle. You may have noticed on that previous slide, the all-cause readmissions is one of our metrics that we track on this scorecard. And we began originally with a baseline readmission rate, and then set our initial reduction goal of 20%. After we had a chance to review those reduction goals annually, or we reviewed those annually, and back in 2019, through a cycle of refinement, we completely readjusted our approach for setting those goals so that it kind of better aligns with our SMART goals. Now, each year, our Harm Across the Board goals are set based on a formula that considers past performance improvements and establishes achievable targets that are specific to like our recent and historical data combined. Other examples on this slide demonstrate that some of these measures, such as top decile performance and employee turnover or patient satisfaction, are both based on national benchmarks. Under innovation, we define excellence as 30% improvement in defined projects, looking for new ways to approach strategic or operational challenges and new value for stakeholders. Under stewardship covenant, the S&P A- bond rating criteria is what we use to define excellence for our organization. So now I think Denise is going to walk us through some of the processes that we use to track data for daily operations.
All right, so this is our process, a figure of our process that we utilize to track data for daily operations. It's called our performance measurement process, and we've integrated our performance improvement methodology in it: the plan, do, check, act, and evaluate, as you can see around the perimeter of the figure. This process was first defined by Clark American Checks. They were a 2001 Baldrige recipient in the manufacturing sector, and then Schneck Medical Center was a 2011 recipient. So they had adapted it from Clark, and then during our journey to excellence, we memorialized it, as we like to say. So again, a great example of learning of past recipients of using the Baldrige Excellence Framework. So let's walk through the model. Step one, that begins with our strategic planning process and helps us set the direction. Step two, if you go around to the left, develops our priorities and measures. And we do that primarily through our 90-day teams. Step three, that's where we execute the plan, put the in process and outcome measures on our scorecards. Step four, that's where we analyze and take any necessary action. Perhaps we need to make alterations and refinements to the process. So that's our check and act step. And then finally, step five is where we're evaluating our data through aggregation. And then those results are reviewed with our operational rhythm that we'll discuss in a few minutes. And then that data feeds back to our strategic planning process. So how do we choose those measures that we're putting on the scorecards and using to track our daily operations? We have a process for that as well. And we again adopted and adapted this process from our friends at Schneck Medical Center, a 2011 National Malcolm Baldrige Quality Award recipient. So take a look at the figure and we'll briefly walk through the process. You can see that on the right, you have a proposed measure. So this may be something regulatory. This may be something that a leader thinks that they need to start monitoring in their department. So we have a couple of avenues on the process to follow. So the first one, excuse me, says it's either a stakeholder or a regulatory requirement. And if that's true, then we simply select that measure as a run the business measure and put it on an appropriate scorecard. If it's not a stakeholder or regulatory requirement, but it's still actionable, go down the left side of the figure, and it also supports perhaps a strategic initiative or a strategic planning goal, then we also select that measure, and it's called a change the business measure, and we would put that again on the appropriate scorecard. If during the selection process we're realizing that we have either maybe a retired regulatory requirement that we've been collecting for years, it's no longer a requirement, or it's not actionable, then we simply don't select that, and we either don't start measuring it or we remove it from the applicable scorecard. So when we first started looking at this process, we thought it seemed pretty impossible, But as we walked through it with each department leader, we were actually able to make it a win. And initially, we were able to eliminate 59 measures that were either not actionable or outdated. So as you can imagine, that was a big win with our caregivers. How we did that was I developed a spreadsheet that had these measure selection process questions and added some additional questions and sent them out to each leader and asked them to walk each of their measures through this, asking these questions. The additional questions I asked them to answer were, who is the data owner? What's the definition of that measure? And what is the data source? Later, we'll discuss how we actually utilize that information on an ongoing basis. For us, we do this process formally every 2 years, but for agility, we're able to add and delete measures at any time, depending on regulatory changes or strategic initiatives. We have examples of several metrics that have been removed from our scorecard due to either not being actionable any longer, regulatory measures changing, etc. And some of those have occurred in our cath lab related to documentation. And then some metrics are also added. So as I said, this can be done at any time if it's applicable. And some examples are probably in the last 6 months or so, we did a root cause analysis in our surgical services department, and we changed some processes and made some improvements. So we placed some new measures on their department scorecard, and that enables us to validate improved and sustained performance. So how do we display and then review our measures on our scorecards after they're chosen? We do that through scorecards. Early in our journey, we had much variation, department to department, division to division in our scorecards, and actually some departments didn't even have scorecards. So what we did was use our 90-day team improvement process to standardize scorecards. We developed templates and non-negotiable parameters that must be included on all department, organizational, and special projects scorecards. The team, in addition to developing those templates, also provided education and ongoing support, as some leaders were less savvy and comfortable with Excel. And that's how we do our scorecards, is in Excel. We have an organizational scorecard with key operation measures that we deploy every month, and Jason referred to that earlier. We also have department scorecards and special project or service line scorecards. Some examples of a special project scorecard may be a service line analysis. So if we're doing a full analysis in order to determine whether we're going to continue a service line for good growth or whether we need to determine some changes in that service line, or perhaps over the years we may need to close the service line, we will utilize a scorecard to help us along the way with that process. Next, I have an example of one of our department scorecards. This is actually from our critical care services. And really what I want to do here is just point out some of the key parameters and those non-negotiable things that were determined during our 90-day team process that all leaders must have incorporated into their scorecard. So along the left, you'll see our covenants. It's pretty small font, so it might be difficult to see. This is just, again, a snapshot of a department scorecard. There are many more metrics on this department scorecard that I have, but I just have captured a couple of snapshots of it. So in the first section, you'll see on the far left, workforce engagement, that's a covenant, as well as quality and safety. And then those are the measures, or some of the measures within each of those covenants. The naming convention is a non-negotiable. So you'll see W1, W2, W3. So that simply refers to the covenant. So W, workforce engagement, and then how many measures they have, and they just simply number those down. The key measure is the name of the measure. And then we have some historical data initially, and then we have metrics either by quarter or by month, depending on the measure. And there is some variation, and that's acceptable, depending on when we measure those different metrics. And then to the right, the far right 3 columns, That's the mean, benchmark, and goal, and benchmark source. Those are also non-negotiable parts of our scorecard. You can also see at the very bottom of this slide, there's an area called action steps, and this is incorporated into our scorecards in order for our leaders to put some snippets of an action plan if they have a metric that is falling out. So if they've had something that's been in red, they'll have a note as to what they're doing, just some key steps. So anyone looking at the scorecard could see, oh, they're working on that. This is the second part of each department scorecard. And this again goes back to when we had our 90-day team standardization, and also the process that I mentioned during our measure selection process, where I asked the separate questions as we were selecting our measures. I asked leaders to determine what is the definition, what's the data source, and who is the data owner. And this makes it very handy for anyone in the organization looking at this particular scorecard, and they need or have questions around a certain metric. They know they go to Rhonda or Ann or whomever. So they're not having to make multiple calls, send multiple emails. So it's really kind of helped us know more about each measure. In addition, when you just have the scorecard and you just have a little blurb under key measure, you still might need some additional information to understand what is that really measuring. And so that's the purpose of the data definition. It's a little more descriptive on actually what that measure is looking at. So again, this is an outcome of our 90-day team around scorecard standardization. And we definitely would not be where we are today if we hadn't standardized scorecards in our organization. So you may think that this one looks a little different than the first one. And that's because this one is, Jason likes to lovingly refer to as the Skittle colored scorecard. So, so as part of the standardization, the team did develop 2 different templates that our leaders are allowed to choose, because we have some leaders that with this one, they just like to have the mean, benchmark / goal and benchmark source. And then we have some leaders that want the target goal, the stretch goal, and the benchmark, hence the Skittle colors. So this is an example of our Medication Resource Center scorecard. So this is a scorecard that grew out of a 90-day team strategic initiative. And then we have an ongoing scorecard to monitor the outcomes of this resource center. So you can see I've taken a snapshot of part of the quality and stewardship covenants on this one. And just to call out one of the things that we continue to look at, because this was an innovation for us as well through our strategy, and we monitor that through the value of prescription assistance. So this is showing that as of July of this year, we have saved $501,000 for our patients. So that's the value of prescription assistance that we've been able to afford our patients in savings. So I just really wanted to show you that while it's standard, there's also some differences in colors and why that was allowed. But the non-negotiables are the non-negotiables for our scorecard standardization.
I get to talk a little bit about alignment boards now, and after hearing Denise talk about all of the processes, it's probably not going to come as a surprise to hear that we have a process to help all of our caregivers connect the dots with strategy, goals, scorecards, and action plans. So several years ago, we created these alignment boards to be displayed in each of our departments. All of the alignment boards, we'll show you a picture here in just a second, but all of the alignment boards have the same content. Each of the documents listed on this slide is on every one of the alignment boards within our organization. And since some of those pieces of information are going to change monthly, we developed sort of a little miniature process to ensure that each board is updated every month. And Denise will email out that updated org scorecard to the departmental leadership, and then they're responsible to ensure that their alignment board is updated. And when we created these, we actually used a group of volunteers to help assist in the initial assembly. and we created over 100 of these alignment boards for just at $1,000. So it wasn't a cost prohibitive venture. It was really quite cost effective. So here's an example of one of the alignment boards that we have within the organization. You can see it's a pretty simple design, lots of great information on there. Standard education was developed as we deployed these, so that standard education went from the group that developed these to our leadership team, and then they deployed it to all of the caregivers within the organization. In fact, there's a lot of the departments here actually will have their departmental huddles around the alignment boards, just so they can reference some of the documents and data that are on there. So at this point, we've already shared a lot of data, a lot of documents. We've got a couple of more processes that we want to talk about. And these are ones that we actually use to help us in the routine review of some of the data that we have. And this is one that we kind of refer to as our operational rhythm. In order to keep ourselves on task, we need to understand that operational rhythm within the organization and use this effectively. We use or utilize an operating calendar. It's a visual representation of many of the more important organizational processes, projects, and work that has the greatest impact on the organization as a whole. We're going to show you this here in just a second, and to me it reminds me of a track. So this operating calendar allows us to appropriately allocate resources, both financial resources as well as human resources, at various times of the year, so that we can prioritize our work as needed in order to accomplish what is necessary to meet strategic and operational goals. So see why I think it looks like a track? But the big difference between a track and this is this goes counterclockwise, and those runners of you out there, you go counterclockwise.
This goes clockwise.
This goes clockwise. The runners go counterclockwise. Yeah. So every quarter, the senior leadership team has a designated day that we call QBR, Quarterly Business Review. And to help, you can see those, they're in the navy blue blocks, and there's one in each quarter. These QBRs are dedicated time set aside for us to meet as a group off-site, and we spend approximately half the day reviewing key results and outcomes from the previous quarter, measuring those against our definitions of excellence, and the second part of the time for those QBRs is spent discussing strategy. That would include reviewing the strategic plan, identifying the initiatives we plan to address with 90-day teams in the coming quarter, and then other strategic discussions we may need to have. We borrowed this concept of a QBR from Hill Country Memorial Hospital, a 2014 Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award recipient, and have modified it to make it work for us. And then in a recent cycle of improvement, we did extend the QBR time from 1 day to a day and a half. And the first day is spent reviewing results, and the second day is a separate full day for strategy discussion and planning.
All right, so we're going to switch to best practices, and through our operational rhythm, those different things that occur and the different meetings that occur and rounding, etc., those are the ways that we capture best practices. We realized we needed a better way to capture them because initially, early in our journey, it was all just self-reporting. So as you can see from this slide, we use multiple methods to capture best practices. The hub is our internal intranet, and that's where we actually have a form, a link to a form, where caregivers can complete a submission for a best practice. We have our 90-day weekly report outs. Those occur every Friday at 9 a.m. And part of our 90-day team process is actually best practice research. So that is a report that in those 90-day report outs, depending on where they are in the plan stage of the 90-day team, that they'll be reporting best practices that they found during the research. Rounding is another way that we can find and hear about and see best practices. And then we also have some meetings and updates and committees where we have made best practices a standing agenda item. The VP Director Monthly Updates is one of those. The Nursing Practice Council, that's our shared governance for our nursing. We also have put it on the standing agenda items for our value analysis team. That is a team of interdisciplinary stakeholders that looks at new supplies, equipment, processes that we may be bringing on. Our materials management leads that team. And also we have an advanced practice provider council that also has best practices on their standard agenda. So here is a picture of our best practice process. So once we had captured those best practices through those different formats that I just discussed, we realized then we needed a hardwired process to include them all the way from when we capture them to implementation and finally documentation. And how we did this was we began to look at best practices in two different categories. They are best practice and recommended leadership practice. So let's take a look at the process first and kind of quickly walk through that. You see at the top in the circle or oval, it says the best practice is submitted via the hub. So again, that's the link on our internal intranet. The DOE, or the Department of Organizational Excellence, that's me. So I share that with the best practice team. I chair the best practice team, and then we have multiple other leaders from the organization on that team. So I share that with the team. We have a way to do that via a shared email. Then we determine as a team whether it's fits either a recommended leadership practice or a best practice. If we deem it's a best practice, you'll see that there's an additional step and it says taken to AS for approval. So that's in the Baldrige Excellence Framework refers to senior leaders. So for us, that's our senior leaders, but we call it administrative staff. So the best practice is taken to that group for approval. And the reason we do that is there may be additional resources that are needed to implement that best practice. You know, it may need to go through a team. You know, there's going to be time involved, et cetera. So that's why we have that additional step. We also go back to the person that submitted the best practice, and whether it's myself or another member of the best practice team, we review that with the submitter and ask them to do a couple of things. One, we need them to come to our leadership group meeting to deploy it, because that is our standard way of deploying both leadership practices and best practices. And then finally, the last step in the process is that we document that, and how we do that here is simply in an Excel spreadsheet, and that's our database. So the differences between a recommended leadership practice and a best practice are this. A recommended leadership practice is simply something that's nice to do. Another leader has found success in that, and the team has deemed that, hey, this is something that's really allowed that department or leader or caregivers to go to the next level in something, or something that we see that would really could potentially help many other leaders. So we have that leader submit that. They then share it at the leadership group meeting, and each leader can determine, hey, does this make sense in my department or departments to implement? So it's their choice. Whereas a best practice, that's mandatory in all applicable areas. And we determine it's a best practice by whether it impacts patient safety and or patient experience. So that's the difference in those two. Here's just some examples of some both types of best practices. So the first one is a recommended leadership practice, and this is shadowing as part of the hiring process. This was first captured during a vice president was rounding on the women and infant department, talking with the workforce, talking with the director, and they had recently hired a new caregiver, and they were sharing how helpful it was that the caregiver came during the interview process after they'd had their initial interview, and they were going to be interviewed again by department level caregivers, that they also offer them the ability to come in and shadow for like a 4 to 6 hour time period. And that really allows the caregivers that they're going to be working with to have more input into the hiring process, and allows both the potential caregiver that's interviewing and our own caregivers to really see, hey, is this going to be a fit? So that was really seen as a win-win for both sides, and they had used it a couple of times. So then that was presented as a leadership practice at our leadership group. So leaders then can determine whether they will make that part of their hiring process. Whereas a best practice, our no pass zone has been alive and well at Memorial for several years. And really what that means is you don't ever pass someone without acknowledging them. And then the expanded no pass zone is newer within the last year and a half or so. And we had one of our critical care services nurses go to a national conference and bring this back as an idea. What it impacts is both patient safety and patient experience. So that's why it's a best practice. What we did was train any caregiver that could potentially be on an inpatient unit and passing a patient room and could see a call light by the light above their door and or hear it, would never pass that room without acknowledging the patient and going in and offering to help them. Now, the non-clinical staff and the clinical staff obviously have very different roles. And if you're up on a clinical unit, a non-clinical person is not going to be able to do every single thing. However, they can quickly address the patient, acknowledge them, find out their need. If it's simply a warm blanket, they can take care of it right at the time, closing their door, something like that. But if it's anything related to care, even a drink, because the non-clinical person would not know those fluid restrictions, then they simply get the nurse. We put the last 4 digits of the nurse's phone up on the whiteboard, so the person can simply look at the whiteboard, dial the nurse's extension, and tell them right at that point that they're in with this patient and this is what they need. So it impacts both patient safety and patient experience. So that's really been a good win for us. We trained all of our staff through simulation. So to wrap up, among other things, we discussed these important things that really we think have been critical to our success during our journey. First being our definitions of excellence and the need to develop those early in the process. That really helped us to know where we were going and helped put everybody on the same page. And then again, we continue to refine those as needed because our journey continues. Second, we also discussed our measure selection process and how that's enabled us to ensure that we're measuring things appropriately, tracking them and monitoring them because they were valid, helpful, they're regulatory requirement, and it's not just to be doing it to be measuring something. It really has meaning. And third, we discussed how to capture those best practices within your organization and how to implement them for improved performance.
That's beginning to kind of wrap it up for us, but I want to circle back. At the beginning, Denise mentioned that we created a booklet before we went in 2019 to receive the award, and it was part of every presentation that we did in Washington, D.C. And we're accustomed to doing the presentation that we just did more in a face-to-face kind of environment. But we frequently will refer to that booklet and the resources that are in there. It covers more than just category 4, and our marketing and business development group deserve a huge amount of credit for it. I don't want us to lose sight of that because Denise mentioned it at the very beginning. But if you'd like a physical copy, just feel free to reach out to Margot, and then we can make sure that you get one.
Okay, we have an opportunity for questions, and we, Denise and Jason, we do have a question in the question box, and it's, can you please talk a little bit more about Hub? Is that an employee suggestion program? How is it deployed, etc.?
Certainly. So the Hub is our hospital update board. And really, it's what organizations would refer to as their internal intranet. We have many, many things available on this hub, from what's the daily menu? And apparently that is the most visited part of the hub. Not surprising. Food's very important.
They don't put desserts on there. I mean,
Well, that's Jason's favorite part, and they don't put desserts, so that's a flat. But also on that, we have several links, and the form that I referred to for best practices is there. Since you particularly mentioned, is this something that employees suggest? We actually also have a spoke program, and the link to that is on there as well. And that is what people would refer to more of as an employee suggestion. That is improvements that would help quality, cost, those types of things. And we have a specific spoke committee, just as we do a best practices committee that reviews all those. We have just updates about COVID right now on our hub. So our infection preventionist puts the most up-to-date education on the hub in a special COVID section. There's a link to human resources. There is a link to our policy management system, which is called PolicyStat, to our event reporting. They can quickly go to that. We have some areas on the hub called quick links. And so you can just go to a drop down and then you could click on our event reporting system, and any caregiver can report an event through the hub. So there are so many things on the hub. I hope that gives you an idea. Jason?
Yeah, there's one other one, and well, not one other one, but one that stands out because I saw them yesterday. Their different departments will promote successes.
Yeah.
And so sometimes, and I'm thinking specifically of one that was up yesterday where it was a door to bedtime,
Door to balloon.
Door to balloon time from our cardiac department. And so certain departments will put wins like that out there for the organization to see.
Okay, we have another question. What are the barriers you encountered and how were you able, whoops, it's moving around on me, just a second. What are the barriers you encountered and how were you able to overcome these barriers? For example, employee engagement, leadership support.
Okay, employee engagement, leadership support, and barriers. And to clarify, are you asking just about the journey in general or anything specific in our presentation? That would be helpful to know. And maybe if the person that wrote in could type in the clarification. But I think I'll start talking and then I'll pause in case there's a clarification. But you know, we had some ups and downs in our journey, and I think one of our low points was, if I'm reflecting back correctly, it was around 2014, and we actually had lower caregiver engagement at that time on our survey. And just as every organization does, we do surveys, and that one came back a significant decrease in our overall engagement. And what we realized is that we really needed to do a better job in a couple of things, and they really play off of each other, but it was communication and trust. And so at that time, we developed things that we continue to use to this day on our journey, particularly around communication. We developed a communication plan, template, process that we continue to use. And we also had determined many more robust ways to deliver that communication and involve all of our caregivers. I think you always think you do a good job communicating until somebody tells you you don't, and then you really need to examine how. And involving our caregivers in that communication process. Also, we kind of doubled down on our rounding at that time, and I think that made a huge difference in trust and communication both. So those are some of the things that are top of mind, and I'll pause now in case there's a clarification, and also then see if Jason has anything to share.
I can jump in on that because I'm a little bit of an outsider. I've been at Memorial for almost 5 years, but for me, and I know Baldridge and the Partnership for Excellence And quality improvement is about processes and the ways that can be reproduced from one place to the next. But I attribute a lot of the successes and a lot of the engagement to the people that we have. And for me, the no pass zone, I think, is one of the most effective ways to really engage everybody within the organization. And I can point back to a period in time where I was here with my wife and she was having a procedure early in the morning, and I'm not from this part of the state, and I didn't know anything about Memorial Hospital, and let alone even how to get here. But this was, and I tell this story often during our new employee orientation, but this was a week between Christmas and New Year's, and we don't get a ton of snow in southern Indiana, but this was one of those days where we did, and it's sort of like the story that our grandparents tell, walking uphill both ways barefoot, kind of a story. But I didn't know where I was going. Where we lived was a different time zone than where we are, and to make a long story short, all of those extra stresses were really minimized by the smile of the first person that we saw when we got to the registration desk at 4:30 a.m. that felt like 3:30 to us. And you know, the face masks that we've embraced in the last 6 months have kind of created some challenges to the no pass zone. But it's even some folks that have a hard time with that no pass zone, the others in the organization, it's funny, they kind of pull the hello or the good mornings out of people. And so to me, I think that that's one of the most successful things. And as a past, you know, my past life as a patient experience officer, I can't tell you how many times I saw on the feedback comments that there's just something different. And as a bit of an outsider, I would point to the no pass zone as being a big way to engage the workforce with one another and kind of supporting a lot of the initiatives that happen.
Well, thank you, Jason and Denise. You did answer the question for the person. So we have a few more questions. The next one is very impressive and useful information. Are there areas in the healthcare center where you have used process behavior charts, and in parentheses it says statistical process control, as a tool for continuous improvement and to assess process capability?
Yes, unblinded data has been very helpful, particularly for our physicians/surgeons. We've grown in that over time. I've been in the director of quality since 2007, and I'd say definitely when I first began that role, we really weren't doing anything unblinded. So then we grew to sharing unblinded inpatient quality measures, and most recently, as Jason and I were kind of sharing a laugh with one another, because it really has been impactful, is unblinded data in the surgery area related to surgeon documentation. So some specific regulatory requirements that we have in the healthcare world around procedural things from a CMS and Joint Commission perspective. So unblinding that and actually doing that, then our regulatory compliance coordinator is getting personal calls from the physicians, and that's okay because we've said, you know, hey, please call her. And then they are coming prepared with their action plans and talk those over with her on the phone. And so we've seen more movement and engagement with that type of control and unblinded information than we have in a long time.
Great, thank you. Our next question, you'll be able to tell it's from one of our examiners. It says, congratulations on your success. Can you talk just a little bit about how the final feedback report has impacted or has been utilized through your multi-year Baldrige journey? Does its impact change from your early years through the national award?
Well, for sure it does, and thank you for that question. You know, I think that's part of the richest part of the process, and I know our president and CEO Kyle Bennett has said that over and over again, that's, you know, even before you've won the award and after, that is key to success, is addressing that. We lovingly call it our OFI log. So we have an OFI log, you know, and we've had one since we started our journey back in 2011 and determined what were our gaps, and before we even really knew what those questions meant, but we began developing an OFI log at that time. So we've matured to having an OFI log now, based on our latest feedback report that we would have received after our national site visit. And then we continue to pull that out and utilize that. I present on it at every quarterly business review. I present to the leadership group kind of where we are with our OFI log. And then most recently, Jason, if you want to jump in about a refinement that we have come together to do related to our OFI log and prioritization.
Yes. We're fortunate to have at Memorial a number of different people who have been through the examiner training, and so we've got a pretty good body of knowledge for people who have been through the process. And as we look at next round of applications and continually work to refine that OFI log from the feedback report, we've started examining each of those and developed a little bit of an algorithm to help us prioritize each of those OFIs that came up. And in doing so, we kind of considered some of the content in the OFI, some of the weighting associated with the category. We looked at the different categories within the entire application and actually surveyed our group of trained examiners and admin staff to find out where they would apply the greatest weights. And so we've used that approach to really kind of help us focus on the key opportunities from that feedback report. And so that's what we're looking at as we are ramping up towards our next application writing here in the next handful of months.
I love to hear responses like that, Denise and Jason. Thank you. We have 3 more questions. The first one is, tell us more about how you increase patient experience.
As the patient experience officer, I told many folks I am one of the luckiest patient experience, or was one of the luckiest patient experience officers in the country, because it is a huge focus within everyone in the organization. And folks laugh that the patient experience officer gets a faster response to phone calls and everything else than others. But our leaders within the department have their unit councils, department councils will look at their patient experience data on a regular basis. We utilized our vendor and some of the resources that they made available to us, working with individual departmental leaderships to kind of analyze that data, look for trends, and then find some key things within each department that will help drive the scores in those areas. It's not about the scores, but those are indicative of the way the department will behave. To give a real succinct answer after that is, I think that our departments do a good job of identifying their own areas for improvement. And so we're not doing anything broadly prescriptive across the organization. It's more at the departmental and even unit level.
Okay, thank you. Then the second question is, can you please define recommended leadership process?
Yes, a recommended leadership practice is something that's nice to do. Another leader has had departmental or personal experience with that in their area, and they've identified it, or we've identified it and captured it through our operational rhythm as a best practice. And then the best practice team said, hey, this is something that other leaders and departments could benefit from. So then we present it as just that, a recommended practice, and other leaders can take that and they can implement it in their department, or they can take it and kind of make it their own. So it's basically just a way to gather what's working for other leaders so that we're not always reinventing the wheel.
Okay, and then our last question of the day is, please talk about your rounding process. Which leaders round? Do they ask standard questions? Do they round on patients also? And how is the process measured and enforced?
I'll start with administrative staff rounding. So that is our senior leaders. We have had a pause on that right now due to the pandemic. We're going to be starting that back up soon. But we have been doing for several years now, rounding in every single department. We have 30 locations that are not here in this particular building. And obviously we have several departments in this building and surrounding buildings right here on this property, but we round in every single location. Some departments monthly, some departments quarterly. We utilize a vendor for that has rounding software. We document some of our conversations and any insights during that rounding. Then that report goes to our leaders of those departments. The leaders then pull that up and develop what's called a stoplight report. So any issues or insights that came up during the rounding that need follow-up will be on the stoplight report. That stoplight report is then placed on the alignment board for all caregivers to see what was discussed and kind of what is the next step. We use the red, yellow, green stoplight for that so they can see where it is in the process. So yes, there is a way to measure that. Then I also report at every quarterly business review over the last quarter what have been the themes and trends in our rounding, any outlying issues, and we also measure and monitor whether our senior leaders are closing that rounding report within 7 days, and then whether the leader that's responsible for it is making their stoplight report in 7 days. In addition, we have triennial coaching. So quarterly, that's called our leadership rounding, and that is where each leader meets with each one of their caregivers on a quarterly basis, and we have standard questions. So that is rounding, and it's also performance review, career progression, etc. And then finally, we have some of our leaders that round on patients, and they don't really have a standard of questions for those patients, except for some of our populations. We do have standard questions such as our Orthopedic Excellence Program and our stroke patients.
Great. Thank you so much, Denise and Jason, for leading us through this webinar and addressing all the questions. Some takeaways I really appreciated was that you benchmarked a manufacturing organization. So that shows the power of the Baldrige criteria, is that you can really learn great processes and best practices from other industries. And I also think it's fantastic that you eliminated several measures. I always say measure what matters. So the fact that you have a process to eliminate outdated or not relevant or not actionable measures is fantastic. So thank you for your presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us. I do want to share our next webinar. It will be, again, the third Thursday, which is September 17th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And our guest speaker will be Harry Hertz, the Director Emeritus of the Baldrige Performance Excellence Program. And he's going to talk about the new normal will require rest. But he's done a little play on words here. And he actually has an acronym for REST, which is RE²ST³. And that stands for resilience, ecosystems, e-wisdom, societal responsibility, telework, transition, and transformation. So I hope you could join us. We will be sending out links to that webinar in a follow-up email, as well as from your program. So thank you everyone for joining us, and have a great day, and hopefully we will see you next month. Bye everyone.